Mitch, will we see the participants?
If you click on the participants list, you should see them. I don't know why. If your screen's not big enough, there's a bar, the participants list on the side, you'll see placeholders for people's video would be. All right, July, take it away.
Okay. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending our Bailey Ridge Park Master Plan Workshop number 2. And sorry about that. My name is Tony Whitler, and I am a parks planner with the City of Salem. And we can go to the next slide, please. And Patricia Farrell is our Parks and Natural Resources Planning Manager. She is not with us this evening, but I wanted to acknowledge her. She is overseeing this project. And with us this evening are Cameron McCarthy, Landscape Architecture and Planning Consultants. And we have Larry Gilbert. Raise the hand, Larry. Liz Avil, Victor Garcia, and Kelsey Zlavor. Larry and Liz will be conducting the main part of the presentation, and Victor and Kelsey are assisting us with the chat and the raised hands during the Q&A. So we want you to be sure to know this meeting's being recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube. A link to the YouTube presentation will be available on the Bailey Ridge Park Master Plan webpage. And I'll have that link in the chat for you, and it will also be available on the last slide of the presentation. Tonight, we'll have a project overview and a question and answer period. We do ask if you could please keep your questions and comments to about 3 minutes. We're going to monitor the time just so we have enough time for everyone to participate. We'll be using the chat and the raise hand function during Q&A. You will be muted during the presentation, but you can use the chat function during that time. And then once the presentation is over, the mute will be turned off. And our agenda this evening, we'll have a brief recap of our first public meeting. That was on January 26th. And we will be going over the survey results from the first survey, and that was from January 26th through February 9th. And that those results and the comments we've received culminated into 3 draft concepts that you'll review tonight. And then we'll have a question and answer period, and we'll talk about next steps and the second survey that will open tonight. And this is the service area for Bailey Ridge Park. Bailey Ridge is a neighborhood park and has a half-mile service area. So that purpley shaded area is the service area for the park. The red line is the urban growth boundary, and that black and yellow line kind of wandering through the top part of the service area is the city limits. But we extended the service area beyond the city limits since you're virtually surrounded by rural and the country club and Minnow Brown to the east. And I'll turn it over to Cameron McCarthy. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. I think I'll start with just a quick recap of our first meeting in January. In that meeting, we introduced the project. We provided or shared our site inventory and analysis. We reviewed different facilities that are available for a park of this kind, which is a neighborhood park. And we also had a Q&A session with all of the attendees. And now I'll review a couple of those graphics we shared in the first meeting. This first one that you're looking at is the documentation of all of the existing conditions on site that we observed after we did a site visit. There are several different, major different types of landscapes at Bailey Ridge. And one of them being this very dense Doug fir forest, the upland to the western part of the site, which also contains or is also surrounded by upland. And then the site is divided by the chamber swale. One second. Okay. So after we documented our existing conditions, we analyzed them and discovered a number of opportunities and constraints on the site. There's an opportunity to increase the number of accessible paths and provide access to the viewpoints on site. That there's dramatic steep slopes on the site. So the viewpoints are an opportunity that comes with the slopes. And also we want to be able to provide access throughout the park. There are also some existing mature white oak trees, as well as some younger oaks and madrone trees that there's an opportunity to protect those. There's also an opportunity to identify and enhance some of the park entrances and just provide additional entrances that are accessible to the park. And the Doug fir forest that I mentioned, that's fairly dense. There's an opportunity there to improve tree health with some thinning. And in the wetland area to the east or to the west, that's an area that we'll want to work around and protect. But there's also an opportunity there to improve vegetation and also increase access to that part of the site with a boardwalk that is not invasive to the wetlands. And there's existing erosion at the chamber swale, but we identified an opportunity there to address water runoff and enhance the habitat and ecological functions there. As well as we were talking about accessibility throughout the site, we see an opportunity to provide a crossing over the swale so that there's access throughout more of the site. So we conducted an online survey following the first public meeting, and we received almost 100 responses. And a majority of those who responded visit the park quite often, responding that they visit several times a week. And in the survey, we also asked folks to rank the best aspects of the park. And the most common responses were evergreen trees or also known as the Douglas fir forest, and open space or the upland area. And a number of the other park aspects ranked fairly similarly. Oak trees, the chamber swale views, wildlife, and picnic areas. It's clear that those are valuable to residents as well. And we did have a write-in category, and a couple of the themes that emerged from those responses were value for just nature and the natural setting overall, as well as amenities that support dog walking, like trash cans. And the survey also provided insight on the importance of potential park features. So we had respondents rate on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very important and 1 being not important, different park features. And we saw that hard and soft surface paths received the highest average rating of all of the options. Other features that ranked highly were quiet space for relaxing or observing wildlife and nature, open grassy areas for informal play, benches, nature play, and landscape plantings. And then others that weren't ranked as highly but received responses were picnicking, a sport court, traditional play, picnic area with a shelter, additional exercise stations, and then disc golf. And we also inquired about excitement for different habitat improvements that we could do at the park. And similarly, we used a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 still being very important and 1 being not important. And overall, we saw invasive plant removal receive the highest ranking. However, the responses were also fairly strong for thinning the Doug fir forest, doing restoration of the creek, and then also wildlife habitat enhancements. So there's excitement overall for a lot of the habitat improvements we could do at the park. And then the first survey, we also inquired about your concerns with this project. And the most common responses we heard were noise, loss of trees, habitat, and natural area, activity from beyond the neighborhood, traffic, and maintenance. And some other concerns that we also heard were parking, safety and crime, and homeless activity. And I'm going to transition to Larry, who's going to talk about park facilities.
Thank you, Liz. So this slide, what we're looking at are different, are precedent images or visual images to get you to understand the kinds of park improvements that could possibly occur at Bailey Ridge. We're showing in a couple of the concepts traditional park outdoor play, but nature playgrounds using boulders and logs and water features and those kinds of things are a newer kind of park element that could be included in many park facilities. And so this those upper 3 slides shows what those images, might look like. As Liz had mentioned, because we want to cross Chambers Slough at some point, this shows a couple of architectural, simple bridge structures that might be able to cross the slough at various locations. In the center of that image is a combination. It's a court, active courts play, but it's a half-court basketball court with the addition of a pickleball court and associated fencing required to work the pickleball court properly. So there's an image of what that might look like as well. And then in addition to the bridge crossings that might occur at the slough, we have wetlands that we want to try and minimize the impacts to disturbing those wetlands. If we start doing earthwork operations or kind of moving the earth around in those wetland areas, it could be subject to review and approval by the Army Corps of Engineers and those kinds of things. So we want to try and minimize any kind of negative impacts to those existing wetlands on the west side in that upland area. And these 2 slides on the left and in the middle on the bottom kind of show how that might occur. We have other ways that we can cross those wetlands as well, but this would be one opportunity that we could consider dealing with those wetlands. And then lastly, on the lower right corner is pathways or trails through a park in Salem that shows pathways through, a forested area. So you could imagine that potentially through the dense Doug fir forest that you have currently, that we would look at, paved universal paths that allow people to move through the forested area of the park. So let's go to the first slide. You're going to be looking at 3 concepts this evening, and many of them will have the same elements arranged in each concept. And primarily it's going to be what do we do about the Doug fir forest. How is the upland, the grassy upland area on the west side of the slough handled? There will be creek restoration or drainage restoration in the slough, as well as removing invasives and restoring habitat in that area. And it's typically that area would probably be a minimum of about 50 feet on either side of the flow line of the creek drainage. So every one of the plans will show that habitat restoration and enhancement. Every slide will show, every concept will show the two at the northern portion by the creek. Those are those two Oregon white oaks that are really pretty significant trees, and it's really important that we try and preserve those. And as if you remember in the existing condition slide, down just off of Rogues Avenue on Tayside, close to the street frontage, there are a number of smaller trees, madrone and Oregon white oaks, that are along the edge there. But primarily there will be, the concepts will show pathways that enter the park site from different locations and traverse through the park. And there's a hierarchy of these paths. They would be either a concrete surface, they would be a gravel surface, or they would be a bark mulch surface. All of these would be universally accessible. And I just want to point out, if you can kind of see on the slide, it's kind of hard to see, but there are white lines, little kind of ghosty white lines that move through the site. This is from the topographic survey of the park, and those are 5-foot contour intervals. So if you were standing down at at the intersection of Rogue and Tayside, up to the northwest corner of the park, there's about 40 plus feet of elevation change between the street up to the highest most point of the park. And we're showing, and the reason we're showing these contours, because universal accessibility, building a pathway or a walkway that enables anybody who might have any kind of physical disability be able to traverse these paths without having to go through building ramps or handrails or any of those things. So the length of these paths are all kind of determined to make sure that none of the paths shown on here would exceed a 20-to-1 slope. I mean, a 5-to-1 slope, I'm sorry, a 5% slope. 20-to-1 is the elevation change. But this concept here, kind of in general, and a lot of these things will be repeated in each one. So I'll probably go in more detail in concept 1, and then we'll look at concept 2 and 3 to see how things have changed. But on every one of the concepts, we're proposing to enhance the streetscape on Tayside. There are existing curbside planters between the curb and the sidewalk. And we're proposing to show new street trees planted along that northern side of Tayside at those locations, and either new lawn or new landscapes in those plant bed areas. Again, the white paths would be concrete paths. And so the neighborhood to the north that kind of bisects through the forest area, there is an existing path off the cul-de-sac up at the north end, which terminates at the property line of the park. So we're proposing that in most cases, there will always be a pathway from that portion of the neighborhood to get in the park through those two buildings. And that would be a concrete path that leads you down to a traditional park playground, if you will. And that playground would include a shelter, it would include some benches, there would be a soft surface play area to receive various types of play equipment. And that would be kind of located kind of right on axis with Rogue Avenue, kind of where the picnic table and the kind of the more public realm of the existing park is now. And that's where the land is the flattest and would be the easiest to build more flat type of improvements and like a playground. And so that's why in this first concept, we're showing the playground, kind of a traditional playground, surrounded by some, finished lawn areas, concrete paths or walkways that travel around it. And then coming off of that, there would be a gravel path, if you will, that heads along the east side of the slough, heading to the north and traversing along that eastern edge of the slough up to the northern part of the slough. And we're envisioning that this would be a concept where you could put a bridge or some kind of a crossing across the creek there. And then adjacent to that, up in the northwest corner, and we have these placed a few places around there, but there'll be a circular kind of gravel area that might have a picnic table or 2 picnic tables in it. But there would be picnic opportunities, like say up in that northwest corner. And then you would take that path and traverse it down the hill again, and some kind of crossing, whether it's going to be a built structure or a gravel path with a culvert or something, so we don't impact the wetland, but cross the wetland at H and then traverse back down to the street there. So there could be a loop. There you can see a variety of loops or pathway systems that people can take to move through the park, with picnic opportunities as well. And then thirdly, the other kind of path would be a bark mulch path, not as easily or readily accessible as the concrete path or the gravel path. Obviously, the concrete is going to be the most accessible route. Gravel would be the second most, and bark would be the third most, level of accessibility. Okay, to the second plan, this is the second concept. So the pathways through the forest, and again, if you can see where the dense forest is fairly existing, it's fairly dense, and there's not a lot of light penetrating it. Some of the trees, because of the lack of light and the lack of care, are not doing as well as they could. So you're releasing those trees, opening it up, removing some of the trees to allow light to penetrate through that wood forest would make it feel more comfortable moving through that space. And this is just another way of looking how to move through it, as opposed to concept one. The concrete path moves through the forest in one way, and then coming from the corner, it's a gravel path, and you can kind of see that gravel path moving through the forest on either side. Where where the previous plan, the concept one, showed a traditional park playground, this plan proposes a natural playground, and with a shelter, with some lawn. But again, here, and we've also, in this one, as opposed to concept one, we've introduced this is a 3-point basketball court. It's not a full half-court basketball court. It's really only like a half circle that allows you to, shoot 3-point hoops. But it's a small court opportunity, just to the left of the main entry into the park. And again, the habitat restoration and repair of the creek would occur on every one of these concepts. And the crossing. So the crossing here, if you recall in the first concept, the crossing occurred almost along the north property line there. Now we've moved this crossing down, so the crossing occurs between the two mature oak trees. And then it transitions into a bark path with picnic tables up at the corner. And then the path moves down, crosses the wetland with another picnic opportunity. And that whole yellow ochre area is really upland grasses for the most part. There would could be wildflowers, some pollinators could be mixed in there, but it's primarily a grass setting. And then we're proposing, and we didn't talk about it in the existing conditions plan, but there is a Scotch pine grove of trees on this western side of the slough, up adjacent to the street. Those trees are all in decline. They're not doing well because of the heavy soils and the wet nature of their conditions. We're recommending those be removed, and then bringing in those green circles in that upland area would be propose new trees, probably native trees, or certainly trees that would be readily adaptable to the soil and climate conditions of the park. Now let's go to the third one. So the third one is a combination of just about everything. So this one proposes that you still have an outdoor or a natural play area, but in addition to that, we have a more traditional square. That red square shows more of a traditional playground with traditional play equipment, as opposed to the nature play in the purple area. Again, there's a shelter there. And then this one, if you recall in the images, we were showing an image of a half-court basketball with a pickleball court painted on the surface. This assumes that you could build a half-court basketball court at the park, as well as paint a pickleball court on the surface and then have two things in there. You would have to have fencing, some kind of low fencing around the court itself to keep the pickleball from leaving the court. So that would be something that would need to be added. But and then another key point, and I think this is probably the best location for the crossing, would be have a crossing of the slough kind of midway through the park, and the paths all converge at that midpoint there. But it's just thinking about the different materials, and it's mostly a trail system, a few park features, whether it's child's play or a shelter or picnic tables or a small court sport activity, and that's about it in terms of the three concepts. If we go to the next slide. So I think that's it for the thing. We'll wait, and we can get back into it further detail in terms of if people have questions regarding the particular park concepts. So Liz,
To go into Q&A, or do we want to go into the next steps, Liz?
Let's go to the next steps and make sure they know
Okay.
where we're headed, and then put that slide back up, I think.
Okay, great.
Great.
Okay, next steps as we proceed on the planning process. It shows here we are, March 16th, reviewing the design concepts. And this evening following our meeting, survey number 2 will open, and it will run through the 30th of March. And in that survey, you will find those 3 concepts that Larry was speaking to, and you'll be able to take more time, look at each concept. We're going to ask you to select a preferred concept. And then we're going to ask you some more questions about what features you favor, whether they're in that preferred concept or not. Just to give us an idea, we'll take all of that information from the survey, from your comments, and any other comments come in after the meeting, and that'll help us form a preferred concept plan or a draft master plan that we'll take back to you at the April 27th meeting. And then we'll be taking that to the Southwest Association of Neighbors on May 3rd. We're going to ask them to endorse that preferred concept draft plan. And then we'll take that endorsement to the Salem Parks and Recreation Advisory Board meeting on June 9th and ask them for a recommendation to council to approve the plan on June 27th. And I just want to emphasize that these are all public meetings, and you're welcome to speak at any one as we move forward in the process. If you're on our mailing list, I will be letting you know, informing you of these steps along the way. And you're welcome to contact me at any point in this process with any questions.
Tony, I might add, in viewing the concepts, when you have more time to kind of review and look at them, I don't think you have to pick concept 1, concept 2, or concept 3. You might like everything that in concept 1, except for a few things that appeared the way they were presented in concept 3. So the final preferred option could be a hybrid or a collaboration, if you will, or a combination of elements that you like in each one of the concepts to get to the preferred concept.
Yes, we are trying to get an idea of which concept people like the most. And then in the survey, it asks, what features do you like and which location do you like a certain feature? So it just helps us hone in on that preferred concept. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
So I think we can move into the Q&A section. And Tony, do you want to reiterate anything about the Q&A, or do you want me to touch on our process for this?
Sure, I can just touch base. Kelsey Zabor, she is monitoring our raised hands, and she has two pieces of paper, a yellow one and a red one. We are asking that you try to stay to 3 minutes. And when she raises a yellow card, that's just going to give you tell you there's a minute left. And then the red card is just asking you to try and wrap up any comments or questions so we can go on to the next person.
Liz, maybe you can stop sharing the slide and we can see people's faces.
Yeah, let me do that real quick.
I also want to chime in. I know people have been making comments and questions in the chat, so I might start there. And then I know there's been 2 questions that have been posed in the chat and at least 1 comment. So the first person, so I'll go through this quick chat first. I think there were 2 or 3 people that had questions or comments. And then from there we can move maybe with the raised hand concept if that works for everybody. Cool. Then the first person I had, Debbie, I think you had 2 questions in here if you wanted to come off mute and ask them.
So the one big concern that people have is the wetness of the park and the neighborhood. It's a real big issue. It's an issue in a lot of people's yards. It's an issue for erosion. One concern is that Douglas firs use a lot of water, from what I understand. And if we start removing them, there might be more flooding in the neighborhood, which this time of the year it can be pretty bad. Plus the chamber swale would absorb some of it. So I just want to know, has anybody looked at what removing the trees, how much per tree can we expect to increase the flow, or is there any construction that's going to be done to try to divert the water or anything like that?
I'm not sure if removing, it's not a wholesale removal. I mean, it's going to be very select. It's really going to be where does the pathway go and which trees do we need to remove to make that happen. I'm not sure, and certainly we'll have to study that, how much water the trees are taking up or absorbing on the site. Certainly everything is sloping towards the street, and that's where all the water is headed, is down to Tayside and and across the street to the neighbors on the other side of the street as well. So I understand that. And certainly thinking about putting some kind of a collector drain system, maybe a very simple French drain along the back of the sidewalk that captures the water before it, because most of it's surface flow right now. It's moving right across the grass and going right across the sidewalk. So maybe looking at very simple, inexpensive ways to try and capture some of the runoff of the stormwater on the park side to make sure it's getting captured and diverted back into the creek, as opposed to, working its way across the street into the neighbors' yards. So I think that would certainly be something we would look at.
I can speak to that as well. Larry, to tag on to what he said, we will be doing a tree assessment of the Doug fir forest. And the idea being that we don't want to remove all the trees, of course. We want to let in a little more light and then make room for the path, as Larry said. And part of that will be assessing some of the trees. Some of them, as you know, if you live right near that, area have had some issues. We've had to remove some already. We're also conducting a hydrology study of Chambers Swale and look at what's causing the erosion and all the wet area there to the west where the pines are. So that will all be assessed. We'll have some recommendations on how to proceed. So we are looking at the water flow in the park in conjunction with our possible development options.
Debbie, did you have another question? I thought you
Yeah, Debbie had a question about when would typically the start and completion
yes.
of the park construction be done?
Yes, that's right. Just wanted to get an idea of, are we talking about 5 years or 3 years or that kind of thing?
Once the plan is approved by City Council, it goes into a queue, if you will, in our capital improvement plan. So we have several other park projects that have been planned or have a phase 1 development and waiting for completion. So they're in a queue basically. And as funding comes up, you know, we move forward on those. And I wouldn't see anything really moving forward for about 5 years, like you said. We usually start with some survey work and then design, and then we seek grants. So even that process does take some time as well.
And then there's 2 more questions that were in the chat, and then I see Bonnie Brown has their hand raised. I saw Nevada Blair had a question. Would you like to come off chat or off mute, I should say, about pickleball court?
can't hear you,
Oh, we
Nevada.
can't hear you. I'm happy to read the question out loud too, if that's an issue. Okay. The question was, does the plan number 2 basketball court also offer a pickleball court?
Well, certainly, I think all of these pieces are interchangeable, and we can, if it turns out that a half-court basketball court or some kind of sport court that has basketball and has pickleball in it, it can go in concept 2 as opposed to being in concept 3. But again, like Tony had said, identify the concept you like the best, and then identify, speak, to those particular elements that you really like or you would like to see in one concept or another.
And we do have a question in the survey specifically about the basketball pickleball combo. So there's a chance to, definitely give us that feedback.
And then I had one more question in the chat from earlier from Dr. Rabago Elena. Would you like to come off mute, or I'm happy to read the question as well? Okay. Oh, there we go. Oh no, you're on mute, I think. Oh no, still muted. Let's mute. Try this. Shoot.
So read the question.
Yeah. Shoot. Sorry. The question is: Concept 3 has 2 playgrounds. Can the basketball pickleball court be located where the nature playground area, I think it's supposed to be, is?
I think the court really wants to be closer to the street because that's the flatter land, and that's the what you're going to require to build a court. It needs to be a fairly, pretty much flat surface, because the nature play can have some topographic changes. You can have different terraces or different levels within that. You can deal with the topography more as you move up into the site. So I would always think that the courts would be closer to the street because that's where it's easier to kind of access it and have those flat court surfaces adjacent to the sidewalk. Moving them farther up into the site, it will create, because there's so much topography, you'll end up building a lot of steep banks or retaining walls in order to build a court of that size. So that's why we're kind of keeping it kind of closer to the park edges, kind of more on the active
Larry-
edge. Yes.
The additional feedback was that I asked because I can see people may be concerned about the noise, and I would love to have the basketball pickleball court. So
Okay. Well, certainly, you know, an active court sport with, you know, kids shooting hoops or somebody playing pickleball is going to generate more noise than, you know, other parts of the park. But again, moving some of those active things that require a flat area farther up into the site will just make it more challenging because of the topography. But it certainly can be examined. You know, it certainly, nothing is, you know, out of the question. You know, it's just more challenging.
thank you. Next I had some hands raised, Bonnie Brown and then Tom Hendry. And so I'm going to do 3 minutes per question. So I'll let you know if we're coming close to being time.
Okay, I don't know. Can you hear me? I don't know if
Yes.
there's some. Oh, good.
Yes.
Okay. I kind of 2 little questions. One is, a traditional, when you talk about a traditional playground, to me that sounds very lots of concrete and lots of that fake squishy stuff, you know, things like that. And I don't even know what's in a traditional playground anymore. So I'd love to get a little more color on what you envision being in there. And then secondly is, for city parks, is there kind of a norm on because I think the noise, you know, everyone's probably concerned with noise, but can policies regulate some of that? Like you know, the basketball court's only open certain hours, but maybe that's just kind of, you know, nobody can really enforce that and it falls by the wayside. I'm just curious if there's any insight into that as well.
The park hours, all of our park hours are dawn till dusk. So the play equipment shouldn't be used, or people shouldn't really be being super active in a park after dusk or making a lot of noise. We changed that recently. We used to have our parks open until our community parks up until midnight, and then we decided that dawn till dusk works fine and keeps some of the noise, you know, in the evenings down. I will add that a standard feature of our neighborhood parks are basketball courts. And we do have other small courts or 3-point courts in some of our neighborhood parks. Brian Johnston in South Salem has one right along the street edge. And we do have them in parks that abut property owners. And they're, you know, we really don't have any complaints that I can tell you regarding those. So, and also if we have it in the plan, it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be built immediately, but you know, demographics change in neighborhoods as time goes on. And so having it in the plan for at a time when folks would like to implement it is good. Then we don't have to go back out and redo the whole master plan process. So keep in mind that some of these features are good to have in the plan for future.
And then Bonnie, to add to your question about the playground, traditional playground or a standard playground, and I would defer to Tony as well as far as what kind is a traditional playground, but typically it would be a play area that has a play structure in it that might be made out of metal and plastics, and it would have climbing, it would have a slide built into it. It would be kind of some of your standard kind of playground structures, if you will. There could be a swing set or other kinds of, you know, depending on the age of the child, other kinds of play equipment or apparatus in that area. And whether it would have a rubberized tile surface for, you know, cushioning and protection, or it could be, you know, wood chips, could be another, you know, safe surface for kids to play on and stuff. But it would be a more traditional kind. When I say traditional, it's like play structures, if you will, that you can see in school grounds and playgrounds, you know, across the state. Whereas opposed to the outdoor playground is much more inventive, much more kind of, you know, natural play. It might incorporate water, it might incorporate science, it might incorporate boulders and logs and some of those kinds of elements. So.
Thank you.
And then next I had Tom Hendry.
Yes, good evening. First, I'd just like to thank the Parks Department for really fleshing this out and putting some kind of frame around it where we can get an idea, kind of start to think about things. I appreciate this. I think you've done a really good job of that. I have a couple things that, there's a lot of stuff to absorb, so this might be a little clunky. I had some questions that I had thought of asking before, and then as we're going through this, many questions come to mind. But the first thing I'd like to highlight is, looking at the survey results, it seemed to me that on the what I would consider statistically valid types of survey results, that it was overwhelmingly more in favor of a nature type of park. Let's say if you count the ones and the twos as being for something or against something, against something, that there was 53% were against basketball courts, 62% were against playground equipment. But then there was a comment, I think the overall summarization that the Parks Department set out was good, talking about that overall the broad interpretation was more of a collective input from the neighborhood, that a bias towards a nature type of park for nature type of equipment, those types of things. But then it also called out that the most common or popular response was from individual comments was about having a sports court. But I think that's not really statistically relevant. Those are one or two anecdotal comments. So I just kind of want to point that out, that and leads into my next question of, as you develop your three concepts, there's two of them with sports courts, there's one of them without. That doesn't really align with the feedback that you've gotten so far. And I get it that you've got to do some different concepts. So maybe my question there is, where does that go from here? And is there any kind of bias within the Parks Department that, I've heard comments that we've got sport courts and all these other parks. So is there a bias that you'd like to see those? Or is it more about the input from the neighborhood? So that's kind of summarization of my first question. And I got another one, but I'll let you respond to that.
Did you want to take that, Larry? You want me to
Well,
take
I'm
that
not
one?
sure.
Okay.
Again, I think, obviously, if the majority of the folks are responding thinking that Bailey Ridge is going to be more of a natural park, given its setting, given the creek, given its topography, given the existing vegetation, that maybe court sports or other kind of active kind of playthings are not appropriate in this park. Again, that's a court, like a half court basketball, as you had said, Tony, is kind of like a traditional park improvement that occurs in a lot of neighborhood parks. Now, whether it's appropriate for this one, or whether the neighbors feel like we don't really want that or need that or don't think we need it, that's really, I think it's between the neighbors and the parks to determine, their priorities and what they would like to see, get built. Yeah, we
Fleshed
showed
out in the second survey as well. We'll be able to really get a good idea
right.
on.
Okay. That's fair. I would just ask that you take in strong consideration the input that you get from these surveys, because my understanding was that was kind of going to be the driver of some of the development features. So I'll leave that one at that. And I don't want to run out of my time. So one of the big questions I had is about, and I think Tony did bring it up to a certain extent, but the soil impacts are a very big issue with the Bailey Ridge Homeowners Association, and how the wetlands issues, all that works out. Couldn't there be a filtration system that mitigates the impact to the downstream neighborhood where some homes have lost their foundation from this swale? That to me is a very key, important thing that I think needs to probably be tantamount of this whole thing. And it just wasn't high on the list of what we discussed today, but Maybe it's outside the nature, the parameters of what we're supposed to talk about, but I think that's an important issue that needs to be addressed. And I also saw one other thing, I saw there were some parking markers on those maps. And my understanding is that with neighborhood parks, there is no public parking. So I'm curious as to what those parking little icons related to in the concept designs.
I think the parking related to kind of, there's an opportunity to do parallel parking on the street, but the park itself does not provide any parking. But showing where, an accessible parking space might occur. We might need to put in an ADA ramp, at the sidewalk to allow for that to occur. But I think it was all going to be on-street parking for access into the park if you were going to drive here to attend the park.
So right now there's
Right.
no parking
parking.
restrictions on that street. Are you
Right.
suggesting you would mark parking spots? I just don't know what, I'm not getting it, I guess, what difference it would make.
Yeah,
I can hop in real quick and just say that it's part of the documentation on the existing conditions. We were just flagging that, currently on Tayside Street, it's big enough for parking and the city allows on-street parking right there. So sometimes it's just helpful for people to see where cars can park and that we're not suggesting building a parking lot in this park.
or even marking the street. I don't think there were marking the pavement to identify parallel parking stalls. I think that's, it's just saying that opportunity is there. To go back to the creek and the drainage, and again, that's getting into more details about how to deal with this runoff, because that creek drainage is really undercut. You can really see how much water moves through that space, through the year. So there are opportunities to slow down the flow of that water by building check dams, by building some flat areas, allowing the water to kind of like fill up in an area, if you will, and slow down, and then move through like a little wall of waterfall or a little weir into another terrace. So there are certainly creative opportunities to look at the drainage to certainly slow it down from what's happening now. Right now, it just kind of barrels right through from the top to the bottom and goes right across the street and under the road and out to the other drainage. So I think there's ways to improve, braid the channel, improve it, cut back the banks, provide more physical access to it, visual access to it, remove all the invasive vegetation, plant, the right kind of habitat. Having the right habitat will help also slow down the water. If you plant material in there that is going to help, kind of slow that flow down. There's a number of design opportunities we can to help mitigate any kind of downstream, impacts.
And the city's also looking at the science behind why it's eroding,
Right.
the soil science, in addition to, getting recommendations, like Larry said, on check dams or whatever we can do to slow the process down. At this meeting here, this is with regard to the park. So beyond that, in the neighborhood, we do have Tom with the Bailey Ridge neighborhood or Bailey Ridge homeowners, association, working with Glenn Davis at the City and Development Services, and they're talking about what can be done and how the city can help in that respect. But that's out of this realm here. But we are focusing on getting some assistance on determining why this is happening in the park and up above the park.
Okay. Well, thank you for listening to my questions. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And then I saw another question in the chat from Debbie Miller. Some of the concerns I read in the survey had to do with an increase in homeless people coming to the park or a large amount of people driving into the neighborhood and parking. I don't share those concerns because we are so isolated, but can you address your experience with this in the past?
I'm not familiar with unsheltered folks camping at Bailey Ridge. Is that what you're referencing? That there are people camping in the park? Or are you talking about other parks? I'm sorry. You may have to reread that to me again, but
Debbie, do you want to come off mute and say that question? Oh, we can't hear you.
You're still on mute.
Uh-oh. Still can't hear you. I wonder, are people being muted somehow?
do you know if she's able to unmute Mitch?
Yeah, it's set for everybody to be able to unmute themselves.
Well, I have, this is Bonnie.
I
have
got it. There was
got
an
Debbie.
advertisement popped up. All of a sudden, I couldn't get back to the main page. It was like upgrade to pro or something. So that's why I couldn't respond.
Okay.
I don't have this concern, but I saw and I talked to some of the people at the HOA meeting, and they were concerned about homeless people and, people, just going through the garbage. And, I really don't think it's going to happen because we are so isolated, but I just wanted to know, do you see these things? How can I reassure them that it's not going to happen or it's unlikely to happen?
Well, I would agree that as isolated as the neighborhood is, it probably would be, very infrequent, but given the number of eyes on that park, we do count on our neighbors around our parks around town to let us know if something's going on that isn't appropriate. It's not an appropriate use at the park, and let us know so we can keep an eye on it. We can ask the police to cruise by and keep an eye on it as well. So we do count on the neighbors to inform us of those things happening, whether it's unsheltered or just some other negative activity going on. I hope that answers your question. Do we have any further questions?
I just had another question about the, if the slowing of the flow could be included in the plan for the park, because obviously the water into the neighborhood comes through the park into the neighborhood. And I realize it's not the park's problem to stop that. But if you're going to go into the swale and you're going to do some things, can some of that damming process be included in the plan? Some of the sloping so that it doesn't flow so fast and clog up the drainage, that type of stuff.
In the report, we will address that those options will, of course, be considered, and that's what we are working on right now concurrently, is looking at the hydrology and how we can slow that flow down. Now, I can say we may not have that report and recommendations back by the time the report for the park comes out, but those will work together in concert as we move forward, because that will probably be one of the first things we work on, will be Chambers Swale.
Are there any additional questions that we can answer? You're welcome to drop something in the chat or raise your hand visually or with the Zoom feature.
And as we kind of finish up this Q&A, could we put the slide back up that has my contact information, the survey, and the master plan webpage link?
Yeah, it should be up now.
So I did want to note that this is a bit.ly link to the master plan webpage for Bailey Ridge, and that we have that up here specifically. It's something that you would type in rather than, obviously you can't click on it. In the chat, I'm going to put the link, the exact link that you can click on to the Park Master Plan webpage. I also have that in, if you're on our email list, I've sent that out to you as well. And then also we have our survey link as a QR code here that you can scan with your phone. And then there's a bit.ly link here too that you would need to type in. The thing about bit.ly links, you have to really type them in exactly as they are. But I believe that Victor has placed the link to the survey in the chat that you can click on. And also I'll be sending out an email tomorrow with the link to the survey announcing that it's up. And if you are not able to access either of these, please contact me at my web address here on the screen and let me know so I can assist you. And if you're not on our mail list, please contact me at my email or call, and I'll be sure to get you on the email list. Okay. Do we have any other additional items? I'm just going to get this in the chat right now. It's at the top of the chat, and I'll put it in here now, here at the bottom.
I'm also seeing a question really quick from Mickey Varney. Which types of trails hold up best to flooding and which types are least destructive to sensitive wetland areas?
Larry, do you want
Do you
to
wanna-
comment on that one? I think you are
Oh,
on.
I'm muted. I'm sorry.
Oh.
Can we go back to seeing people's faces again?
Yes, 1 second.
So the question was, which pathways might be, or paths or walkways would be more conducive to dealing with stormwater runoff, and obviously something that's less pervious, like concrete. You're going to get surface runoff on that, so water's going to sheet right across the top of that, as opposed to bark or crushed rock, where the water will permeate through that. I mean, it still might move through it, but those, more permeable materials would probably be better in terms of runoff or concentrated runoff. In terms of materials that don't float away, obviously crushed rock would probably be, because it's heavier than bark and it doesn't float as much as a bark would, then probably a crushed rock path, if it's maintained properly and it's graded out and rolled and compacted, so it's there's not a lot of displacement and it's a fairly firm surface to walk on, that would probably be the best material to use in terms of overall longevity of the path. The bark will decay and break down over time. So, I'm thinking probably gravel would be the best to satisfy accessibility as well as deal with some of the high, runoff, as opposed to a concrete path. But again, it's not as accessible as concrete. And so people with disabilities or can't get around, having a harder surface or a more firm, smoother surface to walk on would be preferable. That's why we're concentrating it around the playground areas, because that's where most of the families might be. And that's where you would really want it to be as mostly universally accessible. But again, we walked the park, and I'm sure all of you guys, if a lot of you have, go to this park on a daily or weekly basis, it's a hike to get up, to go up to the top and kind of walk around up there. And I mean, it's an exciting park. I mean, it's got a tremendous amount of unique features, with the drainage, with the views, with the vegetation. It could be a real jewel for your neighborhood if we can build it properly and maintain it and mitigate some of the issues, particularly the drainage issues that affect the entire neighborhood. Did I answer the question about the pathways? Is that clear? Okay.
Oops, I'm muted. Any other questions, comments, additional thoughts? Okay.
So contact me if you need to be on the mailing list. My email is in the chat. The links to the survey and the Bailey Ridge Park Master Plan webpage are in the chat. And we will see you again on April 27th And the survey is open until March 30th. Please take it, pass it on to your neighbors.
So Tony, just to kind of the April 27th meeting with the neighborhood would be a presentation of the preferred option. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so about 6 weeks from now, you'll be able to see what everybody wants to see in their park.
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming tonight. We really appreciate the input and the discussion. And yeah, just to reiterate what Tony said, please take the survey. It really helps us document and then move forward.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
And share it with your friends who weren't able to attend tonight to make sure that they have access to the YouTube link and make comments. The broader base of comments we receive, the better informed we will be in designing this park.
Yes, the YouTube link will be available tomorrow, and I'll be in contact with you about our upcoming meeting on April 27th. And as we said, we'll review the preferred concept and move forward. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for attending.
Thanks. Have a
Have a
great
good
night.
evening.
Good night.